That's one way to wake you up. Not the way I intended, but it'll work. I'll try to keep this light and interesting. Yeah, I mean, so I'm Looker's chief data evangelist. Looker's a data analytics platform. We sit on top of amazing, fast, incredible databases like Snowflake. We help you actually get value from all of that data, from the billions and billions of rows that you're storing, because while data engineers obviously like the challenge of moving that much data and storing it and accessing it, business folks who are probably paying the bills probably want to get some value back from that data. And so that's what Looker's all about. I was actually customer number 22 of Looker's. I just checked in our Looker instance back when I ran data and analytics at Upworthy. So I was a customer of Looker's for 3 years, and then eventually kind of jumped over the fence and now get to talk to nice folks like you about what Looker does. So I'm gonna tell you a story, because I figure that's more interesting than talking about Looker. So I'm gonna tell you some history. Some of you may know some of this stuff, some may not. But so back in the Stone Ages, the 1980s, people were just figuring out what this whole BI thing was. The whole term business intelligence was just coming into vogue. And the way that you did BI back then, is there anyone who did BI in the, actually let's not, I'm not gonna expose anybody. So the way that you did BI back in the 80s was you bought a monolithic stack from one of a few vendors who built them, right? That could be business objects. You might buy something from Oracle, you might buy something from Cognos. MicroStrategy came around in the late 80s. And the reason that you bought all of these things from one vendor was because that was the only way to make this work, right? You had to buy an appliance, which is what they called databases back then, because it was actually a thing that came in on a truck and went into your data center and probably cost $500,000 or $1 million. And then you sat their proprietary software on top of it. And that's how you did business intelligence. And basically every decision that you made about doing business intelligence was constrained by the fact that these databases were really slow by today's standards and really, really expensive. And so you did not want to do anything that taxed the database so much that you had to go buy another one, because that would be another $1 million and you don't want to spend that money. So the first struggle, the struggle back then in that first wave of business intelligence, was actually just getting access to the data, right? And the drivers there, the biggest overarching one was that the hardware was slow and expensive, right? Moore's Law was killing us 30 years ago. Now it's magic, and the phones in our pocket are more powerful than those appliances were, but back then that was the core driver. You also had IT, which some of you who are younger may know as the people who fix your laptop when it breaks, but IT used to be everybody who did technology and knew how to turn on a computer back then, and so they tended to own these implementations. And also, you actually didn't have that much data, because rather than having machines collecting 35 billion events from a video platform, you actually often had data entry clerks who were sitting in your store typing in the data. So that's actually how the data got in. Hard to believe, but that's true. And so the struggles that this led to was, one, the way you accessed the data was very inflexible. You had maybe a dashboard, a report if you were lucky, and you did not get changes to them unless you had a C at the beginning of your title. And even then, you'd probably have to wait 3 months. They were very expensive, and you had to do a ton of transformation, cubing, summarization, all these things before you loaded the data in, because that was the only way to get the data small enough that the appliance could actually crunch it and give you an answer in a reasonable amount of time. Now, there were some advantages back then. The first one is that the data was super reliable, and that's because, well, the dashboard never changed, right? So somebody built the dashboard, stamped it with a certified stamp, and you knew that it was going to be right from then on, right? And so if you were closing the quarter or doing your taxes or doing an SEC report, the data was reliable, it was going to be exactly right. There was no question about this. You also had pixel-perfect reporting, which is because you often were actually printing out pixels on paper and delivering them that way, so that was a nice thing. And it was something, which was better than nothing, right? Which is what came before. So that was where we started. People got frustrated with this. They got frustrated because, well, it was inflexible, it was expensive, and the amount of time that it took to actually get value from these systems was enormous. So they started to push back. And we started moving to this sort of second wave of BI, which comes about in the sort of like mid-90s towards the beginnings of the 2000s. And you start to see this proliferation of different types of tools. So rather than only having the monolithic stack, you now had some visual discovery tools. You had ETL tools. You had data wrangling tools. You had a data engine and a silo maybe that was separate from your monolithic stack. You still had your monolithic stack for doing your SEC reports, but you just had this explosion of tools, right? And so the struggle that people had at this point was because you had a lot of different tools, was just getting everybody on the same page, getting aligned about what the data was trying to say. And so, the struggle, or the drivers then, one was that you all of a sudden had personal computers on just about everybody's desks. Sometimes they were even laptops, and they were actually powerful enough and had enough memory and enough hard drive space that you could crunch some of the data in something close to real time yourself. You didn't need this giant warehouse. Now, you weren't pulling all of the data out of the warehouse. You certainly couldn't fit that on your PC, but you could fit enough to do some meaningful analysis, right? So if you were in finance, what you do is you'd ask for an extract from the data warehouse folks. They'd send it to you. You'd load it into your onto your computer, and then you'd hoard it and never give it back and not tell them that you kept it, right? And the data start getting stale, and there are all kinds of problems. But at least you had some finance data that you could actually work on, right? This IT bottleneck of having to wait in line for any changes or any new data extracts, that was very frustrating to people, and so that's why they started moving to this. And you also had more and more data, right? You did start to have machine-collected data, and so the data volumes that people were dealing with was really growing. The struggles that came out of this, well, the biggest one is that, the second wave of BI, they said, let's get rid of the reliance on the, the giant warehouse, the giant appliance. Good. Let's get rid of this bottleneck in IT. Great. Let's get rid of this shared model where we all agree what the data means. This is the record scratch, but I don't have a record scratch, so you just have to imagine a record scratch, right? That was a mistake. And because if everyone doesn't have some agreement about what the data means, you can't do useful analysis on that data, right? And so they kind of threw out the baby with the bathwater. They threw out the stuff we didn't want, but they also sort of accidentally threw out this shared data model about what the data means. You were deeply dependent on data extracts. So while they were saying, well, we'll extract the data and that way we won't be so reliant on IT, you were still kind of reliant on IT because they were the ones getting you the extracts in the first place, right? And then extracts have all these problems. They get, the minute that you cut the cord from the single source of truth, they start getting stale, they get, out of sync. You go into a meeting and you say, my data says our sales are going up, and somebody else says, well, I have different data, and since the sales are going down, and you spend the whole meeting trying to debug and figure out why the data doesn't match rather than, actually plotting a strategy. And then you also had this tool explosion. Now, there were advantages over the first wave, right? You all of a sudden had some agility. You weren't completely bottlenecked, bless you. It was a lot faster. You could load up a CSV or an Excel file into your data exploration tool, and you could do a little bit of slicing and dicing in a lot more time, a lot less time than it used to take. And you had some access to sort of the row-level data because you were working on an extract, so the data wasn't that big. You didn't, again, have the full resolution that lived in the warehouse, but on the data you cared most about, you had pretty high resolution. So, this is sort of where we came from. As you've been hearing today, we actually are in a new world. I think, in general, big data has sort of overpromised and underdelivered as a concept. Over the last 10 years, people talked it up, oh my God, it's going to change everything. And I think in reality, when I talk to most businesses, it actually hasn't changed that much at the business level. However, one thing that it absolutely has changed is the quality of the technology that can actually crunch the data. Right? This started with sort of the Hadoop ecosystem in the early 2000s. Hadoop has some issues, I would say. It's much more reliant on engineers than analysts, and so that's frustrating for analysts. It's kind of, you have to write a lot of bespoke code. Then you start to see sort of on-premise MPP warehouses that were priced at a somewhat reasonable level, like Vertica. Then you start to see the cloud warehouses like Redshift, and then you see this sort of new generation like Snowflake. And so the speed at which the innovation is happening is enormous, and the ability to crunch huge volumes of data is a brand new thing. So big data, in general, overpromised, undelivered, but one nice thing is these warehouses are just incredible. And so, what if storing big data got cheap to the point of ridiculousness, right? What if you were storing 35 billion rows and it it was a rounding error in your bill, right? That is not the world they lived in the 1980s, but it is the world we live in now. What if you could query that big data really, really fast? What if warehouses scaled elastically so you didn't have to, buy a 3-year contract to lock yourself into a certain size warehouse now, but rather could scale up on Monday and scale down on Friday night? What if it was basically no ops, right? You didn't have to pay DevOps people just to sit around babysitting the data warehouse because that required a whole person or a team of people just to keep the thing standing up, right? What if somebody else was handling that? And what if you only paid for what you used? What if that was the world that we were living in? You're probably guessing that is the world we live in. Then what you would want is you'd want a tool, an analytics tool, that actually leverages all the horsepower that these databases bring to the table, right? You'd want data definitions, you'd want that model back, right? You'd want data definitions to keep everybody on the same page. You'd want a platform to make collaboration easy so that it's not Joe in finance is working on that and Sally in marketing is working on that, and when they want to collaborate, they have to send a giant file with the extract across, right? You just want a platform that everyone goes to and they can all work in the same place. You want a data model that's not locked down, but that stays agile, because business today is changing a lot faster than it ever has before, and so you need a data model that can keep up with that. You can't have an inflexible, rigid data model that you write once and never look at again. That's just not the world we live in. And this may come as a shock to those of you in the audience who love SQL. I'll admit it, I love SQL, but I also get really frustrated with SQL. You would want a language, a way to get away from those low-level concerns that make SQL really annoying, right? Which dialect am I in? How do we do date conversions? Which field do I join this one on? It would be much better if you could deal with that once and then not have to think about it again. And that brings us to the third wave. And so that's the wave of a data platform, where your data lives in a database, you pick the one that works best for you. I highly recommend Snowflake, I think you should check it out. It's really cheap to check out, it's kind of amazing. And then you sit a platform on top of it that makes sense of the data and gives everybody the same view of what the data means. And the drivers here, cheap, powerful warehouses, no limits on concurrency. You can have thousands of people accessing this data at the same time. And you've got the internet now, right? Why would you buy a tool that's sort of built in a pre-internet world? It's kind of like if you bought a car with 400 horsepower engine and a 6-speed Tiptronic transmission and wooden wheels, right? You're not going to get a ton of value out of that. You need to upgrade your whole stack. And so you need a tool that's actually built for today's ecosystem. You also need a new way of working, where everyone's actually using the data in their day-to-day to make better decisions. That's the way that you get from just storing a lot of data to actually getting a lot of value from data. And what that gives you is it gives you back those reliable answers from the first wave, which was the good thing about the first wave, right? Because you have a data model that everyone is accessing the data through. So it's not like, well, if I write this query, I know I do the join this way, and if she writes this query, she does the join this way, and so depending on which analyst you're working with, you're going to get different answers. No, that lives in the software, so it's defined once, everybody can see it, and then everyone's getting the same answer. But you get the agility of the second wave, right? You're not locking that model down and saying this will never change. You're instead creating a model that can stay agile with your